Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on a new book by historian Marc Levinson, Outside the Box, How Globalization Changed from Moving Stuff to Spreading Ideas. Dr. Levinson, congratulations on the publication and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're also very fortunate to have with us, or will have with us, I hope, Professors Maya Yasanov and Margaret O'Mara, who will provide initial comments and begin this afternoon's discussion that we hope will involve many of you in the audience as well. A warm welcome to you, Dr. O'Mara, and we'll hopefully be able to welcome Dr. Yasanov. There she is. Let's give it just a moment so we can. Hi, Maya.
Hi.
There.
Welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're already live and recording, and I'm just giving a brief introduction. In fact, I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program, and I have the privilege to co-chair this seminar with Eric Arneson of George Washington University. Eric also serves as director of the National History Center. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program. For more than a decade now, the seminar series has tried to provide a nonpartisan forum in the nation's capital to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications that shed light on policy-relevant issues in global and national affairs. Prior to the pandemic, we met on a weekly basis at the Wilson Center, but we're now very pleased to come to you via Zoom and Facebook Live, and we're delighted that many more people have been able to participate in these sessions. Behind the scenes, two individuals helped produce this event: Rachel Wheatley for the National History Center and Peter Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We want to acknowledge our supporters and also thank our two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University History Department. We welcome your support. Donations to our organizations are tax deductible. So as we're slowly heading towards tax day in the US, here's a great idea on how to lower your taxes. Give to the Washington History Seminar. Details about how to do so are available in the chat right now, or simply go to our websites, National History Center and Wilson Center. A couple of explanations, technical notes. Today's session is being recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A of part of this webinar, please use the raised hand function in the Zoom functionality if you would like to ask a question or make a comment. Once you press the button, you will be entered into a queue. When the moderator calls on you, you will receive a prompt that will ask you to unmute your screen. Please press yes, and you will be able to talk. You can start getting in line, in queue, even before the discussion period. If you're following us on Facebook, you may also submit your questions to Rachel Wheatley via the email at rwheatley@historians.org. And with that, I'll turn the Zoom room over to my co-chair, Eric Arneson. Eric,
thank
all
you,
yours.
Christian. Thanks very much. It is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome Marc Levinson, an independent historian living here in Washington, D.C. His previous books include The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger, published by Princeton University Press in 2016. The Great A&P and the Struggle for Small Business in America, published by Hill and Wang in 2011, and An Extraordinary Time, The End of the Post-War Boom and the Return of the Ordinary Economy, published by Basic Books in 2016, a book which he presented when we were meeting in person at the Wilson Center for the Washington History Seminar. Today, he'll be speaking on his latest work, Outside the Box, How Globalization Changed from Moving Stuff to Spreading Ideas, published by Princeton University Press last fall. So, Marc, the Zoom room, the screen is yours.
Eric, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for coming. I do have fond memories of those days when we met in person at the Washington History Seminar. I hope it won't be too long before we can do so again. My book, Outside the Box, is meant to be a brief history of globalization. I know that sounds like a tall order, but the notion here was to write a fairly short and very accessible book, which provides some structure around thinking about globalization. There's obviously been a lot written about globalization over the years. Much of it tends to be either rather technical, written in economist speak, or rather emotional. I've just got a few things from my own library. You can find this, for example, or if you want to hear a different version of globalization, you can find a term, the economic horror. So there's a lot of literature out there, but there's not really anything that I think is accessible to a non-specialist reader that puts globalization in a historical context. And so that's what I was attempting to do here with Outside the Box. Let me take you through my argument. I guess for starters, globalization doesn't have a precise definition, and I certainly don't attempt to give it one. But I would suggest that there are some things that differentiate globalization from what came before. It's often said there's nothing new about globalization. It's been around since the time of the pharaohs, you know. It's undoubtedly true that there was international trade back in the time of the pharaohs, and there was international migration and so on and so forth. That's not the same as globalization. I provide a couple of examples just to give you a sense of the scale and the intensity of modern international exchange compared to what there was in historical times. Everyone knows that Venice was the world's greatest trading power for a couple of hundred years around the 13 and 1400s. But if you actually run the numbers, the total amount of cargo that came into Venice in a given year was a fraction of what's carried on a single modern container ship. In the entire Venetian merchant fleet, the cargo capacity was about 26,000 tons, and those vessels made one trip a year from across the Mediterranean to Venice. The Portuguese trade with the Spice Islands, another example of globalization. Well, perhaps, but over a period of a century, the 15th century, the 16th century, the Portuguese had an average of 7 ships a year sailing from India to Portugal. They carried pepper because cargo was so expensive, it didn't make sense to carry anything except a very high value product. So yes, you had trade. You had trade almost exclusively in luxury goods, very high value goods, which is why you see Europe's chateaus and palaces filled with Chinese porcelains and silks from Japan and that sort of thing. But you really did not have international commerce anywhere near on the scale that you have today. Moreover, you had a large proportion of the population in most countries totally insulated from the international economy. You had countries where most of the people were simply engaged in farming on a subsistence level or on a very small commercial level. Their lives were not affected much by the availability of foreign goods, by the availability of imports or exports, by the availability of migrant labor. That was not a situation that I would define to be globalization. I just globalization has having gone through 4 distinct phases, and now we're entering the 4th. The first started around the 1820s or the 1830s with the rise of industrial capitalism. I know this is something that's been much studied when did capitalism begin? When did the modern economy start? And that's really not a discussion that I want to get into here. But it's important to note that starting around that time, international trade really took off. There were large factories for the first time. There was large-scale commerce in things like cotton flowing to British textile mills. There was large-scale trade between the European countries and especially their colonies. There was a great deal of international investment. By 1913, so the onset of the First World War, the value of international trade was probably 42 times as high as it had been a century earlier. So trade really exploded. But there's some characteristics that I think distinguish the first globalization from what came later, and I want to point to those now. One is that there was really no such thing as an industrial supply chain in the way we think of it today. Most trade comprised primary products, commodities, and they were sent from one country to another country, and when they arrived, they were put up for sale. So it was really not the case that a firm in the receiving country, the importing country, specifically organized a supply chain to have components arrive at a particular time, to have specific products delivered at a particular place. They were generally buying when the stuff landed. Primary products accounted for the majority of trade. As late as 1913, 90% of the exports from China, 100% of the exports from Brazil were primary products, whether it was rice or coffee or ore or wood or coal. That's what was mostly traded. And more than 3/4 of international trade during this period was to, from, or within Europe. So this is not globalization as we think of it today, not by any stretch. There was certainly a great deal of foreign investment, but again, almost all the foreign investment was European money, mostly British money. It was significant, to be sure. It built the US railroad system, it built the Argentine railroad system and the Argentine meat industry, and there are many other examples. But on the scale of modern foreign investment, if you look at it, for example, as the flow of foreign investment relative to GDP, it was really a fraction of levels we would later. So the first globalization peaked in 1913 for obvious reasons. The First World War kind of put an end to it. I point out that there is a dispute among business historians here. There are business historians who take a look at multinational companies and will tell you that the 1920s in particular saw a great deal of investment by multinational companies in Europe. That's true. Nonetheless, the flow of foreign investment dropped quite precipitously after the start of war. International migration in most parts of the world tailed off very steeply in the 1920s. So this was not globalization in any stretch as we think of it today. A second globalization developed after World War II. Here, it was really the efforts of governments to reduce tariffs that were at the heart of this boom in international trade that set in. We're all familiar with the Bretton Woods agreements, the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the rounds of tariff cuts that started out in the late 1940s and gathered steam in the 1950s and 1960s. These contributed to a large increase in international trade. To give you some scale, the world's exports as a share of the world's GDP were less than 8% in the late 1940s, and by 1980, 1982, they were around 12%. So trade did become much more important. One of the major factors in the increase in international trade during this period was the rise in petroleum trade. And of course, this was related to the development of great tanker ships and the exploration for oil in many parts of the world. It's worthwhile recalling the nomenclature of those days. Trade occurred between the North and the South in many cases. The North was also known as the core, the developed countries, the wealthy economies, and the South, the periphery, the developing economies, typically exported commodities to the North and received manufactured goods in return. Globalization, and of course the term was not used then, was widely perceived as being unfair to the poor economies. It was something the South didn't think led to fair treatment, while the North, the wealthy countries, tended to praise international trade and foreign investment. They thought this was great because it provided export opportunities for their products. This is a situation which has certainly been reversed today. Globalization during the second globalization period was initially heavily in the area of international trade. International investment began to grow significantly in the 1960s. And then in the late 1960s, we had this boom in international lending. Those of you of a certain age will remember the LDC debt crisis. And to my previous point, it is interesting to talk about the LDC debt crisis and have someone a bit younger than you ask you what LDC stands for, because that nomenclature is long gone. But this debt crisis, which basically made it all but impossible for developing countries to import goods, really put an end to the second globalization. It was supplanted in the late 1980s by a third. And there were some significant things that changed here. One is that the cost of shipping fell very substantially due to containerization. Another was that the cost of international communications fell significantly, due partially to deregulation and partially to technological change. And then computing became more powerful. These things in combination made it much easier to run a foreign subsidiary, made it much easier to communicate among foreign subsidiaries or among contractors in a different country. Now, multinational firms, instead of dealing with one foreign country at a time, which was the previous practice, could actually construct international supply chains. They could figure out where it might be best to make each product and send a raw material from here to there, send a part from there to someplace else, have the part be assembled into a component someplace else, and then have the final good be made someplace else still to serve markets far, far away. This type of relationship, which we now think of as globalization, really was able to develop in the late 1980s and 1990s because of these technological changes. It simply did not exist before. But it's important to realize that this version of globalization was not the first globalization. It really emerged out of these two other episodes of globalization that I have mentioned previously. To think about why this happened, I sometimes find it useful to remind people what a telex machine was like. Most people today have no concept of what a telex machine is or was. But it used to be that if you sat in an office in New York or London or Amsterdam, and you wanted to communicate with a supplier or a subsidiary in Brazil or in India, you wouldn't make a phone call. It was unimaginably expensive to make a phone call. You would sit at effectively a typewriter. It was a machine which had a typewriter keyboard. You'd print out a punch tape. You'd run that punch tape through a machine and use the dial on the machine to call a telex machine at the other end. The punch tape would run through, and at the other end of the line, the telex would print out a message, the message that you had typed in. Well, this was a way to convey factual information. It wasn't a really good way to convey more sophisticated, more subtle messages. It wasn't a good way to deal with all you needed to transmit in order to effectively manage an enterprise or a supply chain. And this sort of thing was no longer necessary by the late 1980s. Telex machines went out of style as the third globalization developed. It's useful to think about what happened to international trade in this age. Manufacturing exports as a share of the world's output were about 10% at the onset of the third globalization. They would grow to more than 16% in 2008. Trade in electronics grew 20-fold between 1980 and 2012. And most of the stuff that was moving around the world was not finished products. It wasn't something you could go into the store and buy. It was intermediate goods. It was stuff that was partially made here and was going there to be manufactured further before it went off to a retailer or to an industrial client somewhere else around the world. This type of relationship simply did not exist. And this is the relationship that is associated in most people's minds with the ills of globalization, the job loss in the industrial communities, the so-called deindustrialization of some wealthy economies, the outflow of investment supposedly from wealthier countries to emerging economies. This is the trend that was associated also with a very rapid growth of a number of economies that previously hadn't had much by way of industry, not least China and parts of Southeast Asia. So this third globalization, what we have come to refer to as globalization, but really this third stage of globalization, is what transformed our perspective on international exchange and international relations. This is still perceived of as globalization today. I think what escaped notice is that manufacturers' trade as a share of the world's output peaked in 2008. Exports of goods of all sorts as a share of the world's output peaked in 2008. Foreign direct investment peaked in 2007. What went on is that we had a financial crisis starting in 2007. International trade and international investment declined, as typically happens in an economic downturn. And everyone expected that they were going to pick up again after the recession was over. In fact, my friends in the container shipping industry were betting on this. They built these enormous ships because they were sure there was going to be a trade boom after the recession and they were going to have trouble accommodating all this cargo. And so they built ships that could carry as much cargo as 6 or 8 or 10,000 trucks apiece. But what happened was that after the recession, international trade grew sharply for a year or two and then leveled off. International trade as a share of the world's output has never gotten back to where it was in 2008. Foreign investment has never gotten back to where it was in 2007. International bond markets have never gotten back to where they were in the early 2000s. International lending has never returned to previous levels. So even as we have politicians around the world decrying globalization, and particularly globalization in this form with these long international supply chains shipping partially finished goods around the world, even as politicians have decried that, this kind of globalization has been receding. Where it's going is not a decline in international trade. I don't think that we see that, but I think we see some other things happening. One is that this third globalization was extremely heavily subsidized. Ships were subsidized, and not just by the shipbuilding countries. It was possible for a German investor in the late 1900s and the early 21st century to invest in a fund that owned a ship and receive a tax break equal to 2.5 times the investment. A pretty good deal. So ships were cheap. At one point in the early 2000s, more than 1/3 of the new container ships coming online around the world were owned by German investors. And because they got such breaks on their taxes, these container ships could be built for less than their actual market value. And those savings in a competitive market were passed on to shippers. So the cost of transportation for all these goods moving around the world didn't really reflect the cost of building and operating these ships. There were immense subsidies to manufacturing, whether directly in cash or in the form of favors from governments. Yes, there have always been subsidies of this sort and the other sort, but never on the scale of the 21st century, where governments were devoting hundreds of millions or even billions to specific companies' efforts to build a factory here or to build a warehouse and distribution center here. There were subsidies to the ports. If these large ships that were being built needed to call in a port, well, maybe a bridge needed to be raised so they could get there. And it was a pretty rare case that the ship owners or their customers had to pay for that bridge. That was paid for by the general public. And then there were environmental subsidies. The shift of manufacturing to developing countries in some cases led to greater pollution, in some of which was felt in the wealthier economies because it blew around the world. It led in some cases to greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from the steamships that carried the cargo and the trucks that moved the cargo from the ports. It led to, in some cases, water pollution because there were no controls in these countries and they didn't know how to manage their systems and for environmental protection. So these externalities were not included in the cost of producing or transporting the goods. These are all forms of subsidy that globalization received during the early years of the 21st century, not to mention the financial subsidies, which became very apparent amid the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, when governments had to bail out many companies, many financial companies because of bad international investments. Over the past few years, we've seen international trade generally continue to grow, but much more slowly than the world economy. After 2 decades of growing at twice the rate of the world economy, international trade has been growing at about half the rate of the world economy for the last few years. Similarly, international investment has been underperforming the world economy. We've got an economy which is not breaking apart. Globalization hasn't ended, but the form of globalization that we saw during the third globalization is receding. I know I'm meant to be a historian, but in the conclusion of my book, I take a little bit of a look at what I think is coming, which is that I think we're going to see international trade increasingly deal with services, some services which are noted and recorded in statistics, some services which are traded within international firms but never show up in international statistics. This is really going to become the core of globalization over the next few years, which is why I refer to it as a fourth globalization. The sort of globalization that we're accustomed to from the decades of the third globalization, this massive movement in goods and particularly in goods in process, is going to slow considerably. One reason for that is that all of us are getting older and older people don't buy as much stuff. Another is that a lot of things that have been traded won't need to be traded anymore. Those containers full of car parts, for example, are mostly going to go away as we move into the age of electronic vehicles. And it's very easy now, and we've all learned this by teleworking, to manage services remotely. And so I think that's really the new direction in which globalization is going to be headed. I like to remind people that most of them, like me and probably like you, have spent a lot of time during this pandemic watching Netflix. And when we do that, whether we're watching a show about an Indian matchmaker or a Tokyo restaurant or a Danish school teacher or whatever it may be, we're watching a services import. We're watching things that have been traded in the new era of globalization. And I think that is where globalization is headed as it deals more and more with things that move outside the box. Thank you very much. And I very much look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Mark. We have two commentators this afternoon, and I'll introduce one, then later the other. The first is Maya Jasanoff, who is the XD and Nancy Yang Professor of the Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. Her first book was the prize-winning Edge of Empire, Lives, Culture, and Conquest in the East, 1750 to 1850, published by Knopf in 2005. Her Liberties, Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World was published by Knopf in 2011 and received the 2012 National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction and the George Washington Book Prize. And her The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World, was published in 2017 with Penguin and won the Kundal Prize in History. Maya, Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Eric and Christian, and thank you, Mark, for writing another incredibly rewarding and stimulating book, which, among other things, has just such a clever title. I just want to thank you for that. It's always a pleasure to see a book whose cover does it justice, as this one does. So I got to know Mark's work when I sailed on one of the ships about the size and generation of the Emma Maersk, which he writes about in his book. And the ship I was on was called CMA-CGM Christophe Colomb. It was built in 2009 at 13,830 TEU. And I sailed on it really traveling in the globalization of the age of stuff, the third globalization, as Mark describes it, stopping in ports in China, which had been built, within the last 10 years or so, flanking Hong Kong, stopping in a huge port in Malaysia, which also had to be sort of built in order to accommodate these giant new ships. Likewise, another one on the coast of Morocco, just opposite Gibraltar. One of the fascinating things about this is that the sea lanes themselves don't really change. You still have the Straits of Malacca and the Suez Canal, but the places on the coast that you pull into have to be reformatted for these new technologies. And this whole ship, which was a third of a kilometer long, was manned by no more than 30 people. So I read, of course, Mark's book, The Box, and this book helps situate that world of the box, I think, as we move further into the 21st century. I had gotten to know container ships, though, on a different generation of thing. And that was back when I was in graduate school, and I sailed on a vessel called the MV Maltese Falcon. This was a vessel which had been built in 1978, and it was 556 TEU. Which gives you a sense of the orders of magnitude that we're talking about change over the course of about 30 years. It was a roll-on, roll-off vessel. It was owned by the state-owned shipping company of Malta, now dissolved, called Sea Malta. Hence the name Maltese Falcon. I'm sorry, I should have sort of saved that up for a more humorous delivery. And it did a round from Genoa to Valletta to Tunis. And I took it on a couple of those routes. And I was one of the only passengers. Well, I and a friend of mine were the only passengers, apart from a couple of truck drivers who had rolled their vehicles on and were going to roll them off. And they spent the whole journey closeted in the small lounge on board with the curtains drawn, smoking and watching pirated action movies. At that time, I think they were even on video cassette, believe it or not. On the bridge, there was a skipper from Iraq who let us peer at the charts and, play with the instruments. There was a cook called Salvatore who had these sort of decades of C1 wisdom, which he would dole out with these emphatic outbursts, which I remember as being composed chiefly of nouns. And there was a rather laconic sailor by the who looked like Mr. Clean, whose job was to slick green paint onto the deck. That's what he was doing during my voyage, and as I sat there, sunbathing by the empty pool. So this thing, I mention it because it was sailing not like CMA-CGM, Christophe Colomb into brand new purpose-built things that were expressions of a third globalization. It was actually operating on older routes. It was sailing into Valletta, which in its heyday had been the home port of Queen Victoria's Mediterranean fleet, one of the most important harbors in the British Empire, site of a huge naval dockyard. And that naval position was sustained even in the late 90s when I was there there was a French and an American vessel in port at the time on a NATO patrol. And Malta, of course, also is a strategic hub between not only on the east-west axis of the Mediterranean, but the north-south axis. And there was a vessel that came in a couple of times while I was there from Benghazi, bringing what appeared to be bringing a shipload of young men who I assume were coming to Malta for work. And so all of this was excellent proof for me, I think, of the fundamental insight of Marc's book, which is that globalization does come in stages and kinds, and he's just outlined for you the 4 stages and kinds as he expresses them in this book. But it also tends to kind of build on itself with each of those phases, amplifying or having to sort of deal with the legacies of the ones before. And I want to come back to that in the final portion of my comment. But before I get there, I just wanted to pull out a few things that I thought were particularly sort of memorable about this account, and pop in a few questions I'd love to hear Marc's thoughts about, or of course considerations from my fellow panelist or anybody else. So one of them is the fascinating through line about the aspirations of deregulationists and the kind of globalization boosters versus the gritty reality, or I don't know if it's gritty necessarily, but the sustained and palpable reality of how much regulation and subsidy has actually helped globalization winners get to the places they are. So I was struck by the observation that Marc makes early in the book that as recently as the turn of the 19th century, the average European family was unlikely to possess imported goods beyond a sachet of sugar and the occasional coin stamped in sugar and stamped in silver. And that's really striking for me, particularly as a historian of the British Empire, when there's such a literature about the consumer revolution in the 17th and 18th centuries and how much there was an abundance of stuff. Just a reminder of how kind of recent some of this is. And as he goes on to say, for all the talk of globalization, manufacturing, even in the early 21st century, was not as global as the term suggests. Only a handful of countries became manufacturing powerhouses, and many others are exporting, agricultural goods, for instance. So there's a kind of sorry, I've been jumping around a little bit here. I was going to talk about deregulation, and I'm going to come back to that, but I'm talking about the stuff here. I'd say that, with respect to the stuff, there's actually much less in the way of a kind of globalization of goods than I would have expected. It comes later, and it comes more variably than the term globalization might suggest. And so what I wondered about that is how much certain sort of physical and tangible qualities of different states and regions matters to this story. For example, the size of a consumer population, the size of a labor force, obviously natural resources, climate. How much does that actually affect a country's ability to win or lose from globalization. Circling back to the deregulation and subsidy part, I'm sorry, I got a little bit goofed up in my notes here. Regarding the sort of boosters of globalization through the ages, there's such a utopianism of certain figures from, in his way, Ricardo, or certainly someone like Richard Cobden, up through Robert Schuman, insisting that economic cooperation brings peace. But as you say, Mark, quote, the third globalization was not simply a market-driven phenomenon. Government shaped it at every turn, often in ways that were contradictory to the goals their political leaders espoused. And China's late 20th century growth, as you show, is related very much to the selective use of subsidies, of incentives, of tax breaks to people, corporations to locate their factories within China, and then taxes on exports to privilege the domestic market. And I love your point that you make, in various ways throughout the book about how subsidies may matter more than comparative advantage in determining what gets made where and who profits for making it. So my question from that is, I guess, sort of what are the lessons for political economy, when we hear, obviously now, ongoing debates about, the appropriate structures of tariffs versus free trade as a source of enormous, political tension in, in Western Europe and the US, among other places. When, how does that look when we realize that even in the age of the third globalization, there were actually a lot of ways in which, subsidies and so on were doing work in order to make that profitable for the people to whom it was profitable. The final segment that I wanted to touch on is about the role of shipping, which is, of course, so profound throughout this book. And it is both the engine and the emblem of sorts of the third globalization for you. And you talk about how, I guess I wanted to hear more about how you see the role of shipping as an industry and thinking about the future of globalization as we head into the fourth era, as you signal it. You talk about how Maersk, for example, is busily, swallowing up other shipping companies, and how, quote, in the span of a few years, a highly competitive industry had become an oligopoly, unquote. And I found myself thinking here, of course, of other industries in which that seems to be the case. Trade publishing would be a good example, where they're all swallowing each other up. Many other, retail with Amazon. And I'm wondering, actually, if shipping here is the way the industry functions, leaving aside what ships are actually doing, is that a kind of end stage of the third globalization more broadly, or does that, what does that have to say about how business is organized as we head into the fourth globalization, as you have it? And then maybe the flip side to that would be, maybe one could also see shipping as being in many ways what it really is, which is anomalous. It's a very odd industry in all kinds of ways, due to the costs, due to the risks. It has been the locus for innovations of important kinds, Lloyd's shipping insurance, but it's also, quite sui generis. So, is it rather actually sort of an outlier in various ways? And if so, what does that have to tell us? So let me, just to conclude then, circle back to the question of how, of how different eras of globalization, as it were, sort of layer onto each other. So CMA-CGM, the operator of the Christophe Colomb, is like Maersk. It's one of the big behemoths of the shipping industry now. It will, its fortunes will certainly sort of map onto whatever comes of this third globalization. The owner of the Maltese Falcon, by contrast, which I took back in the late 90s, has had a quite different fate already. Sea Malta was dissolved, the state-owned shipping company. The vessel was sold off in 2006, and it was scrapped in India in 2009. But Malta continues to have a shipping registry known for offering pretty attractive terms as a flag of convenience. It has 8,000 plus vessels registered there. 6% or thereabouts of the world's tonnage. Malta has been, until pretty recently, I think there may be some crackdowns in place. Some of you may know more about this, a popular tax haven and a site for shell companies. So it, sort of does well on some of the ways in which it does occupy this kind of liminal space, despite being in the EU. And now, the Libyans, I doubt that there are ships coming from Benghazi, with workers from Libya, but boy, are there rafts and small vessels and refugees who have been coming over those waters by the thousands for many years now. And, I guess it just leaves me with the thought with which I'd like to leave you that, you talk about globalization in terms of imports and exports. And of course, that's a, globalization, through the lens of trade is a fundamental, way of seeing globalization. But of course, it also does have these other forms and consequences and, neighbors in, trade and import-export has other kind of things around it in the legal and economic and political and cultural sort of webbing that is laid over national borders and, for that matter, maritime ones, and are the source of so much pain and strife and conflict today. So I just wondered, as a final question, what you think the outlook is for some of these kind of more, material remains, as it were, of the third globalization as we move into, if indeed we do, a fourth that has to do more with ideas than it does with stuff. Thank you.
Maya, thanks so much. Marc, some responses, if you wish.
Just very quickly, because I'm eager to hear what Margaret has to say about this. I think Maya emphasized the point, which is absolutely correct, that while we think of globalization as having taken manufacturing offshore from the rich countries to the low-wage countries, there are very few low-wage countries that have benefited from this. Globalization has been as negative for plastics manufacturers in Nigeria, if you'd like, as for plastics manufacturers in the United States. It's benefited a small number of countries that have, whether because of labor force issues, policies, trade relationship with an existing power, have been able to grab a large share of the movement in manufacturing. So you can see that China, Bangladesh, Cambodia, until last week, Burma, these countries have actually been arguably beneficiaries of shifts in manufacturing, whereas most of Africa and most of Latin America has been left to the side. In part, that's due to the fact that many of these countries have had protectionist policies for years. Many of them have poor infrastructure, but they also have just had, in general, not had policies that and labor forces that made themselves attractive to foreign manufacturers. A big issue here in these offshoring decisions for companies has become reliability. And I talk in the book a lot about risk, and many of the countries that have been shunned as manufacturing locations are countries that are perceived as being risky and having a greater risk of business interruption. I think that the point about deregulation and lessons learned is more than I can go into here, but I do think that economists really need to evaluate the use of this notion of comparative advantage. The reason why is because comparative advantage is usually used to argue in economist speak that international trade is welfare enhancing. But if trade isn't actually occurring at market prices, then it's not clear why, in a theoretical sense, it's welfare enhancing. It may be creating just a different set of distortions. And this really is not something that economists seriously evaluate very much. So I would really love to hear more about that. I'm going to stop there for now and hear what Margaret has to say.
Thanks, Marc. Our next commentator is Margaret Amaro, the Howard and Frances Keller Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington. She is the author of Cities of Knowledge, Cold War Science and the Search for the Next Silicon Valley, published by Princeton University Press in 2005, Pivotal Tuesdays, 4 Elections That Shaped the 20th Century, University of Pennsylvania in 2015, and most recently, The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America, published by Penguin Press in 2019. She also writes frequently for public audiences and is a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Margaret, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you, Mark, for your remarks and for the opportunity to read your book. I'm going to start, like Maya, with a personal story that reading Outside the Box brought to my mind, which was in 2006. I was in Shenzhen, China, the original special economic zone, the original Chinese experiment in capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And I was giving a talk at Tsinghua University had opened a branch in Shenzhen, as had Beida, Peking University. The 2 top institutions in China had opened branch campuses near the manufacturing hub of Shenzhen. And I gave a talk that in the Q&A greatly disappointed. And my talk was about the history of Silicon Valley and how it came to be, and what the Cold War had to do with it, and the early history of the Valley. And all the questions I got, particularly from the municipal officials in the audience, who were very keen on how to move Shenzhen up the value chain and bring more advanced sort of design and manufacturing into the region, which is a very large, where the iPhones and others are made. My answer at the time, well, perhaps I had not honed my talking points enough, but my answer was a historian's answer, which was that it's very complicated and it's very contingent. And there's a whole complex bundle of factors that go in. There isn't a formula. One cannot replicate it with ease. And so there went my chance at becoming, a human McKinsey and telling everyone how they could build another Silicon Valley. But the chase for another Silicon Valley globally has been one that has involved considerable amounts of state subsidy, considerable amounts of boosterism, deregulatory enthusiasm, as well as great amounts of investment, in indirect and direct, and but also hopes for this very simple formula. And it made me, the reason I was thinking about this as I read Marc's book, which is, I think, valuable for a number of reasons. One is that it is nimbly goes through centuries of human history and gives us a framework for globalization that is neither designed to strike terror in our hearts nor to boost us over the moon, but to give a much more realistic and historicized understanding of these broader phenomena, and bring and show patterns of emerging over time and also contrasts. But also in that it defies the, kind of pushes against, in a constructive way, the desire for this simple, oh, you just need 3 things and then you just, build a research park and they shall come. And also this reductiveness that I think characterizes, certainly in the United States, political conversations around globalization, around NAFTA as the thing that stole all those jobs, that the reason that Southwest Ohio is having such a hard time is because of this trade policy, because of offshoring, and if it were an easy, singular causality, if it was an easy thing to fix, it would have been fixed already. And so one of the things that sort of really jump out of I think that are, and this is something in a way, Maya, as you were talking, I think you and I kind of had this similar reactions on some of the similar questions, because of course there's this really important strand that is often lost in the public conversations, particularly ones that are kind of, that are framed in terms of the kind of the triumphal and essentially private sector nature of globalization, which is free markets triumph and thus all the good things happen, is the role of state subsidy throughout all of these phases of globalization that you outline in the book. But what's so interesting is how they are national projects, right? So you have the US space race or the Cold War generally, the military industrial complex and the space race is part of it. being very much a project of national competition and national, sort of coming from an American national project that has global impact. Similarly, economic liberalization in India or at this provincial level in the 80s and at national level into the 90s is very much a national project that has global economic implications. Similarly with China and special economic zones, et al. And so I guess one of my questions, and where you end, this is a book that finished its your last edits in the during COVID or post-COVID era, so it references our current moment, is how in this moment, both of era of political nationalism, of rising nationalism, as well as the realities that of the COVID pandemic, both that has reminded us of our shared fates, as well as necessitating a sort of renewed multinational push towards broad vaccine accessibility, for example. How you see that kind of the future, if you could just elaborate more on this sort of future of where these national projects and the role of the state flows. And then the other thought that that really jumps out in this, maybe because you do start with a very large container ship in the opening scene of the book, and then continue to emphasize the significance of bigness, whether it be in container ships or large infrastructure projects or other sort of large companies that are financing and investing these flows of trade, is, as you might expect, as someone who's writes about the history of Silicon Valley and the landscape of contemporary technology, I've been thinking a lot about the bigness of big tech. And your mention, Mark, of Netflix reminded me that the thing that powers Netflix is not just Netflix, it's Amazon Web Services, on which Netflix runs. I speak to you here from the hometown of Amazon and Microsoft. And how that bigness is in this emerging fourth wave. And here I am, a historian, asking you, a historian, to be, be perspective in your thinking. But how bigness of companies is becoming entrenched. I've been thinking a lot about how technology companies, comparing and contrast these as global multinational companies versus earlier ones. One of the challenges from a regulatory perspective is, in contrast to, say, the automobile industry, where Ford Motor Company had and has to develop and sell different models in different countries depending on the fuel standards and the standardization of you have different markets have different products, whereas the Google search engine is an undifferentiated product mostly. The Facebook is to disastrous effect in some parts of the world, an undifferentiated product with global impact that's designed by a bunch of upper middle class people on the West Coast of the United States who have the accordingly narrow worldview that comes with that. So how bigness is, wherefore bigness, and particularly as the United States is moving into a moment where antitrust enforcement, congressional oversight of mergers and acquisitions, et cetera, is getting a closer scrutiny. How should we think about this in a less reductive way and a more nuanced way? And what does this mean for the companies that are not enormous and not global in their scale? So I'll leave those thoughts there, but I greatly enjoyed this book. I'm glad to have this forum and all of these people listening in. And again, a great, much accomplished in a very lively and nimble narrative. And it's wonderful seeing all of these things brought together. Much food for thought. So thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Mark, some thoughts and responses before we open it up.
Just a couple, and some great points, Margaret. And in terms of the future of the state, one thing that I would disagree with Margaret about slightly is the role of who is the state. In much of the world, the state is in fact the national government. I say that in this country, probably less so. In the sense that a vast amount of subsidy runs from state governments or local governments to corporations in ways that affect globalization, and the federal government doesn't have much to do with it. In some cases, it permits it implicitly through the tax code. Just to give you a brief example, Amazon has built hundreds of sorting centers and fulfillment centers and so forth around the United States. These have facilitated goods trade, imports specifically. They've reduced the cost of handling imports, and almost all of these were subsidized not by the federal government as much as by local governments that wanted to have this in their jurisdiction. So the subsidies problem is really quite enormous. You see high-level fights going on now and then. It proves to be very difficult to deal with this through any legal means, because by the time you go through a couple of years of legal process, whether in the US International Trade Commission or the World Trade Organization or some other country's legal process, the situation has changed. Facts have been created on the ground and the subsidies themselves have been altered in some way. And so what you're shooting at is no longer there. And this is really quite an intractable problem. So I think what we can get away from is this notion that, hey, this is just the efficient market at work here, reallocating production around the world. And you see a lot of that. You see the argument that somehow the United States and Europe and Japan are headquarters economies, and so we have some comparative advantage in doing whatever it is that headquarters offices do. And meanwhile, other countries have some implicit comparative advantage in making stuff physically, which we do less of now. And I think that argument just really needs to be scrutinized very closely. And as I said earlier, I would really like to see some economists think about changing the paradigm here, because that's the paradigm that everybody imbibes in high school, and I think it's really demonstrably not a useful paradigm for understanding the world. This question of bigness is an interesting one, both with respect to the digital industries that you've written so much about, but also in other industries. And here I'm going to come back to the ship that Maya sailed on back in the 1970s. Back then, there were hundreds, literally, of companies running ships around the world, many of which carried some containers. You wouldn't describe them as container ships, but they had some containers on them. And it was easy to enter the industry, and it was easy to exit the industry, and a large number of firms did over the years as they failed. Well, container shipping has become an industry that it is all but impossible to enter. And many people who've written about the industry don't understand why this is. In other forms of shipping, and previously in shipping general goods, this was done on a one-off basis for the most part. If you want to ship a load of oil or a load of cattle or a load of iron ore, you have a ship come here, pick up the cargo and sail there, and when it's done, the ship gets another job. In container shipping, you have a ship that plies this particular route, and it leaves Hong Kong every Wednesday, and it stops at these ports, and it shows up in Rotterdam or Felixstowe or Los Angeles so many days later. And it does this with regularity every day of the week, week after week and year after year. You can't enter this business unless you have enough money to buy enough ships so you can do that, and do that on multiple routes. So you're talking about needing 7 or 8 identical ships just to serve one route between China and certain ports in Europe, or serve one route across the Atlantic. You can't enter the business. And that's what has driven us to this oligopoly. The problem is that the oligopoly is facing the prospect of diminished demand. Things are going great now, mostly because people around the world can't spend on services, so they're buying goods like crazy. But fast forward to the end of the pandemic, spending on restaurants and vacation trips is going to go up, spending on stuff is going to go down, and we're going to have a lot of empty container ships again. And The companies are dealing with it by trying to diversify into other parts of supply chain management that they think will remain lucrative once the volume of shipping tails off. They would all like to be logistics providers. They would all like to have some of the skills of Amazon. They'd like to be freight forwarders. They'd like to have intellectual property that they can tell companies how to manage their supply chains. That's where they would like to go. Whether they all get there, I'm not so sure, but that's sort of the notion. Because as did happen to some oligopolies in this country historically, an oligopoly can be kind of hard to sustain when when demand diminishes. You're still stuck with all this capital, and it's hard to employ it profitably. And I think that's what the concern is in the shipping industry. I think it's a fascinating topic and one I'd love to go into more, but I'll stop there for now.
All right, thank you. We're now going to open this up for kind of general question and answer. Folks who are watching who have questions can do so and pose them in a number of ways. You can use the raise hand function on Zoom. When we call on you, unmute yourself and you can identify yourself and ask the question, or you can use the Q&A function in Zoom as well, or you can email from the address in chat, Rachel Wheatley, with your question if you're watching on Facebook. The first hand in my queue is that of Sonia Michelle. So if you would unmute yourself, introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hey, Sonia Michelle, Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland, College Park. Can you see me? I guess you can't see me. No.
Just hear you. That's
okay.
Good.
Okay. I have a question and a comment. The question is, and maybe you just answered this, Mark. I had to step out for a minute. I take your point that the international trade these days is increasingly that in services rather than manufactured goods. And I just wonder what the impact of that would be on the shipping industry. Maybe you just commented on that. I missed it. But I just wonder if you could say something about that. And relatedly, I don't think you've mentioned or anyone else did the impact of airplanes on the shipping industry and why you think it has not happened that or to what extent has air transportation taken over international shipping, or is it just too expensive to really achieve that on any kind of large scale? And my comment it pertains to the last part that you talked about the exchange of how international trade was increasingly going to be in services, not in goods. Putting on my gender hat, as I'm wont to do, I think that one area that's still going to remain more or less the way it is migration, and that is specifically the migration of women mostly women to perform care work from going from poorer to richer countries. You can't export granny. We can't export our children to be taken care of somewhere else, or maybe we will at some point, but not yet anyway. So instead, what we're doing is, and especially because of the gender revolution in so many countries, and women wanted to leave the home and go into the labor force, although now we're not leaving anymore. But anyway, so we need to there's a continuing demand for female migrants from poorer to richer countries to perform care services. And so I think that's one way in which a certain kind of asymmetrical globalization is going to continue for quite a while. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. The last point also goes to the question that Maya raised at the end of her comments about how people fit into this change in globalization. I don't have any terribly recent numbers, but I think we've seen barriers to migration going up around the world. It's a whole lot harder to do this in many countries than it was just a few years ago. We certainly see this in the United States. We see this in the UK. We see this in continental Europe, where you can migrate within the EU, but migrating in from outside the EU is a lot tougher than it was. And we're seeing this in parts of Asia and Africa. So all of those things don't bode well in terms of the absolute numbers of migrants. I'm aware of the demographic pressures in a number of countries. And that's something that's going to have to be reconciled. But we also have a lot of countries that are in a phase of very slow population growth or even population decline. And these include many so-called developing countries. So I think we're actually going to see a lot of the pressure for migration from some of those places diminish if it has not already done so. In terms of airplanes, sure, airplanes are an important source, not so much of volume in international trade, but in value. Okay, it's the high value stuff. It's a lot of what Margaret writes about. A lot of the semiconductors and things like that are going to move by air. And so that has made a certain type of trade possible in the sense that if you're trading things with potentially short shelf life, trading things that are going to become obsolete quite quickly because technology advances and they're superseded, all of those things move by air, and that's going to continue. There has, though, been no change in the underlying fact that air freight is extremely expensive relative to sea freight. And so I think that the bulk of goods in international trade move by sea, and that's going to continue. On the broader impact of trade and services, I just did want to toss in one point here, which I do discuss in the book, and that is that this is something that's very poorly measured and probably not well measurable. And that is going to affect the way in which we discuss this in the future. We capture transactions in international trade, and that shows up in our evaluation of services too. If you have a company in one country that outsources a call center function to a company in another country, that at least in principle ought to be captured by our data on services trade. It doesn't always make it, but it should be. But think about what goes on in one of these giant companies that Margaret was talking about. Suppose that you are developing a new piece of machinery. You have an engineering center in Cleveland. Okay? You have an engineering center in Seoul. You have an engineering center in Darmstadt. And during the US workday, some people in Cleveland work on this project. And then they hand it over to the engineering center in Korea. And then they hand it over to the engineering center in Germany. And 24 hours later, it comes back. Okay? That's a way of handling a basic business task that never is going to show up in the trade statistics. Okay? Nothing has been transacted between companies. The firms themselves don't really care whether this new product was developed mostly in Cleveland or mostly in Seoul or how many hours in Germany went into it. They're not going to measure that. And we have no idea how much trade of this sort is occurring. But we have reason to think that there's a great deal of it occurring. Things like pharmaceutical research, semiconductor research, these things are moving around the world, and it's not really sensible to think of them as occurring in a single location for the most part. And so how do you measure where the economic benefit is? How do you determine where the value added is? The long answer is we really don't know. And I think that this lack of data is going to make it difficult for us to come to grips with the growth of trade and services.
Thank you. If David Sobelson would unmute himself, you can introduce and ask a question. And I should point out, Margaret and Maya, if you have thoughts or observations in response to the questions, please feel free to jump in as well. So David.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. Humans can't fly, we can't swim that well, we don't have much strength, but we can use the ideas and insights of other humans. What do you think of Johan Norberg's recent book, Open, The Story of Human Progress? In that book, he argues that globalization has brought human success and freedom for millennia, dating back to the ancient Greeks and Chinese. And number two, what is the greatest threat to the prosperity and freedom we have derived from globalization, if you think we have derived prosperity and freedom from it?
I'm not familiar with Johan Norberg's book. I will put it on my reading list, but I'm loath to comment on it. I haven't read it. It's an interesting point. I think one of the great threats to globalization is this sense that is palpable that the benefits are unevenly distributed. And that is within countries and not just within the wealthy countries. You hear much the same comment in lower wage countries, that some people benefit from globalization and many don't, and are continuing to have low wage jobs or live at subsistence levels. And I think this obviously triggers political backlash. It's worth noting that this political backlash has not occurred only in the United States and in Europe. It's become an issue in any number of other countries, including a good number of Latin American countries, for example. So there's a significant question about how what this does, not just for the macro economy, not just for the GDP, but how the benefits are distributed. I don't know any country that's done terribly well in that. I think there are probably some countries that have better social welfare systems than the United States does, and perhaps the angst is a bit lower there.
Thank you. Michael S., if you would unmute and introduce.
Hello?
Hello.
Yes. Can you hear me then?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. First, a quick comment. An example of how the cost of sea freight is so low is that essentially the flow of it in one direction subsidizes the flow in the other direction. And because the ships returning to China from the US going across the Pacific in that direction are generally empty or relatively empty, as I understand it. This is my question. I mean, you've covered the changes quite well that have been wrought by globalization, but what is being done with respect to the negative side effects of it? This would include relaxation of movement of capital, but at the same time restricting movement of human capital, and also the problems that are caused by these international trade agreements that are given these broad sweeping powers in other countries as far as their immunity from judicial action and the legal system in many countries. I know that's a problem that was a problem with NAFTA, and I think also with ALCA, the New World's equivalent thereof. I can take my answers off the air, but thanks for responding to my question.
Sure. On the side effects of globalization, in some cases, governments have had a bit more success in dealing with some of these. If you can think of, for example, the Paris climate talks, that is an attempt to deal with some of the side effects of globalization. The International Maritime Organization has made an effort to limit emissions, both of greenhouse gases and of other kinds of gases from ships. That's an effort to contain some of the side effects of globalization. So there are things definitely going on here. It's interesting that one of the most important developments that has really restrained some of the negative side effects of globalization is a firm's fear of business risk, and in particular of reputational risk. It's fascinating to think about what's gone on recently with respect to cotton from Xinjiang in Western China, where there has been the assertion that this cotton is linked to cultural oppression of people in that region, to unfair working conditions, to imprisonment of people, or forced re-education of people. And in many other countries, there has been an objection to imports of goods containing cotton from Xinjiang. Well, I would bet you that most of the retailers that were selling apparel made with cotton from Xinjiang had no idea that they were selling apparel made with cotton from Xinjiang. They were dealing with an apparel manufacturer, and the apparel manufacturer was dealing with textile manufacturers, and the textile manufacturers were getting their fibers in some cases and their threads from other places. And there was a supply chain that's got the cotton from somewhere. And some of these retailers and name brand clothing companies were quite shocked to find that they were under attack for using cotton from a place that they'd never heard of. The lesson for businesses is that reputational risk is very real, and that if you are perceived as engaging in unfair or damaging practices, it can hurt you very badly and very quickly before you have time to adapt to it. And so there's pressure on business to pay attention to its supply chains. And that has to do with mitigating other kinds of risk, but it also has to do with mitigating the sort of business risk. I don't pretend that that's a cure for all of the ills induced by globalization, but I think it is important to see how this works, because for businesses, particularly businesses that deal with consumers, your brand matters a whole lot. And if your brand is tarnished by association with things that your customers think are not right, whether it's ill treatment of workers or pollution or other kinds of activities, it's going to hurt your company. And this is a front burner issue now, I think, in the business world.
Margaret, I see your hand.
Yeah. I just Mark's note, this question and Mark's comment makes me also think there's a parallel here in the moving ideas side of the moving things to the subtitle of the book, where the questions over regulation of content on social media platforms and other platforms that are also efforts like the General Data Protection Regulation out of the EU, the GDPR, that are efforts to contain the negative effects of globalization, so to speak, the globalization of ideas when they spill out over and have different effects, unintended or otherwise. And I think it's also akin to what Mark was saying about some of these things are either you don't realize that this is part of the supply chain or the value chain, or this is not something that's actually, the way that one gets a cheap t-shirt, all the stages that are involved in it. The same thing goes with the dissemination of ideas and things via software, which also has to do with a fundamental incompatibility, which I think you don't see with the movement of things, where social media platforms were designed to sell ads on the internet, and they are now functioning as political town squares across the world, as main venues of political communication. And we've discovered that in many ways they're not up to that task, and the way that they're designed and the way they're being managed and the algorithmic amplification that's built into the business model is not well suited to healthy political discourse. But the other point that this raises too is that we talk in terms of moving, going from things to ideas. And I think everything, and what one valuable thing that Mark's work underscores here is that really these two things are coexisting for quite some time. That globalization has always been about both moving ideas and moving things. And that even in the software industries, there's a physicality, materiality to the whole infrastructure. There's server farms, there's electricity being consumed, there's things being shipped by container ship or by plane, that there are physical things as well as more ephemeral things that are shaping this global economy across different industries.
Thank you. We have some questions in the Q&A, and one is from Robert Hayer, who says the following: globalization counts on putting a circle around your sub-tier supply chain and then weighing risk, travel times, and cost for restricting tariffs. How should international tariff regulations be regulated to meet every country's interests?
In most cases, I think tariffs really don't much matter to the world at this point. There's some specific countries and some specific commodities where tariffs matter a great deal. But for the most part, tariffs have fallen to levels where they're not really the major factor in business decisions. There are estimates, for example, that half the automotive trade between Mexico and the United States does not occur through the NAFTA agreement. The NAFTA agreement has various requirements on content added in North America in return for tariff-free access to the United States. And effectively, firms are saying, we don't really need the tariff-free access. The tariff is 2%, we'll pay the 2%, what the heck. and then we'll do what we want with our business. So I don't think we really see tariffs being used very much in most cases. There's still some notable exceptions to that, particularly in apparel and in some ag commodities. But by and large, the trade discussion has moved well away from tariffs to less visible, less measurable forms of trying to exclude other countries' goods.
Will Coleman asks, how optimistic are you about the next decade for the United States and its allies in this fourth stage of globalization?
Interesting question, which I've tried to actually give a little thought to. I think we have some wonderful strengths here. As a historian, I'm somewhat concerned by the extent to which our thinking lags the reality. And you see this in a lot of the discussion now, for example, about capturing manufacturing. And people are thinking of a model in which a factory is where manufacturing occurs. But the reality is that a huge part of the value in manufacturing doesn't occur in that factory these days. It occurs in the form of the intellectual property to make the goods, to design the goods, to ship the goods, elsewhere in the value chain. That's why I use in the book the term value chain, because so much of what used to be called the supply chain isn't really physical supply. It's these other sorts of inputs into the manufacturing process. And we don't really discuss in public dialogue the way in which these industries have shifted in the direction of ideas mattering so much. I think that there's a lot of reason for optimism. One is that the United States and many other wealthy economies are all facing labor shortages in the not too distant future. We've had very low birth rates. There are a good number of countries in Europe and in Asia where populations are already in decline, or at least working age populations, and that benefits workers. I think that there is a question as to how to deal with the workers who have the skills, don't have the skills to deal in this kind of economy. And I think that's an old question that isn't going to go away. But I think the basic demographic changes are going to be quite positive for workers. Charles Goodhart has a new book out on this subject, which I think addresses the impact of coming demographic change. And it's really worth thinking about. We're not used to being in a labor scarce environment. We may shortly be in a labor scarce environment.
So as we're running out of time, I want to pose kind of explicitly a public policy question. So in recent years, not so recent years, different constituencies, Republicans, Democrats, have criticized globalization, and particularly they've attacked various trade pacts. So, NAFTA has come under considerable fire. The Trans-Pacific Partnership similarly was demonized by some. If you were to be an advisor to either Republicans or Democrats, on this issue in terms of thinking about these pacts, how would you critique or comment upon what they're saying, and what would you advise them to do?
Well, I guess the first critique would be to stop referring to these as free trade agreements, because there's nothing free about a trade agreement that goes on for hundreds of pages, or in some cases several volumes. Okay, these are designed to shape trade in a particular way. I would make one comment that I think I don't really address in the book, but I think people are not paying enough attention to at this point. If globalization is shifting in the way that I'm suggesting it's going to shift, this has some negative implications for inflation. There's a lot of discussion going on now in the United States about whether we're getting back into an inflationary era. And we associate inflation or low inflation with monetary policy. But it's also the case that the globalization of manufacturing in the third globalization really suppressed inflation. We were able to import many products at much lower prices than would have been possible had they been made domestically. And that has helped hold down consumer prices. If you take a look at the prices of things like clothes and shoes, they're actually lower just in plain dollar terms than they were 20 years ago in many cases. So globalization has been very helpful in fighting inflation. If I'm right that we're moving away from this rapid growth in goods trade and to a different sort of globalization, that may have some very negative implications as there may be more price pressures coming in the markets for consumer goods.
Unfortunately, we have to draw this to a close. We're now at 5:30. I want to thank Margaret and Maya and Mark for your observations and comments. And I'm going to turn this back to Christian, who will draw us to a close. Christian.
Thanks, Eric. The next session of our Washington History Seminar will take place this Friday, February 26th at 4 p.m., when we will discuss Catherine Gray Katz's new book, The Daughters of Yalta, the Churchills, the Roosevelts, and the Harrimans, A Story of Love and War. Thanks again to Mark, Margaret, and Maya, and Eric for just a really rich and terrific discussion. Thanks to our audience for watching and participating. We're adjourned. Stay safe. Good night.